So with that, first of all, happy Madaraka Day. Thank you all for coming on a public holiday. Positioning it on today was a risky one. I didn't know if it was a good or bad thing, but we'll see. And great to see you all here for it. So I think just to give you a quick sense of the structure for this evening, Diana and I will speak and run up to, but in a very interactive form, till about 8. And then at that point, what gets really exciting is beyond listening to me, we do breakout groups. And what that entails is really breaking up, mixing, meeting new people, and having conversations on some of the things we touch upon, bringing your own experiences with whatever you're comfortable to share. And from there, I've seen those conversations go till, well, past when they close. Many of you have been there for 11, and I have to be the one to kick you out. So they're really engaging, and if you can, stick around for a bit, but this is an evening, so feel free to leave at any point. So I think to kick off, what I'd love to do is, before I introduce Diana, just give a bit of a preface to this conversation that we're going to have. And one where is informed really from previous conversations with people who have come, one individual in particular who really came up and forced me to reflect on the way I was positioning these discussions. And so with that, I think it's really fitting. Today, it's Madaraka Day, the Day of Independence, and the point where 60 years ago or so, in 1963 and 64, the British were finally having to leave Kenya. And leaving Kenya at a point where they had plundered, massacred, oppressed. But finally, there was this amazing moment of freedom. And I think what is often forgotten, it was freedom in many kinds, but there was still a narrative, there's still trade, there's still power imbalance. And that's something that perpetuates and continues to today. And I think that narrative, which was an incredibly powerful one, which is what continues to fuel the discrepancies in the world that the British did and the Empire did in many other countries, is one of, inferiority, differences in people, culture, races, and using that as a lever. And I think as we sit here, this wasn't something that independence suddenly disappeared and was liberated. It's something that persists today. And I think there's an amazing play, hopefully some of you caught it at the Kenya National Theatre, Ngugi wa Thiong'o and Wamidi's play, And I Will Marry When I Want. And that was spectacular because I think for many reasons, and the incredible acting and team there, but it conveyed, I think, the ways in which that narrative of superiority was very much captured and proffered by players who continued in the space, who took over power. And it means that we live in a space today where I think we have to speak about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It has many dimensions, but certainly the Kenyan Expat one, where we are talking about situating it in a deeper global systemic space of racism and the issues that means. And that manifests in the ways in which as expats we come here, the aid sector here, the HQs, where they're positioned. And so I think that has to be the ways in which, and this kind of the seriousness with which we treat it, as opposed to what can often be seen as an add-on to a workplace. I think the other element of that is, as much as a systemic racism, and that applies in one sense of Kenyan Expat, there's a much larger context of inequalities. And all of us in this room are very fortunate to be here in our own positions. And I think broadening, as Diana will do a great job to contextualize, broadening this notion of diversity, equity, inclusion to include our own inequalities, our own positions beyond race into class and other elements. And so that's where I think this comes in and applies really to us all. So I think with that, I'll just highlight that I think it's an uncomfortable conversation. It's a hard one. I'm still working out and continuing to learn, thanks to conversations like with Diana and others, about the different ways it applies to me and my decisions and how I choose to be here, why I choose to be here, what I do here. So I think it's really brave of you guys to turn up, to engage with it. And this is the first step to really collaborate and find space. Yeah. So with that, I thought what would be great is today is a really interactive session. Diana really wanted to make that key to how we had this conversation. And so love to do is get a first sense of hands up for people who work in a workplace that is mixed Kenyan expat, at least by that dimension. That's just one, but just to get a sense of that. Okay, so quite a few, majority here, which makes sense given the discussion here. But that will be interesting. And I think the other element of that is, in whatever sense you choose to define it, who feels that they kind of have a diverse, equitable, inclusive workspace? And you can put your hands up now. Okay, you don't have to be scared to claim that. You can, but that's good. Thank you. There's one. Half, which is all you can expect, but that's very honest.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah. Well, with that, Diana,
yes,
please take over, and I'm so glad and so thankful to have you here.
All right.
I'm speaking just from my perspective, but Diana brings your research, your work, your podcast, and so pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Arnav. For you who don't know me, my name is Diana Sifuna. I have a podcast like most millennials that was started in 2020 called Diversity with Diana. And I was doing my thesis for school, and I was very moved to discuss or to go into the study of human labor and getting efficiency in work labor. And I wanted to do something about mobility. And my professor was like, Diana, that's too much. This is just a master's. You just need to do something simple. And I was like, no, but I'm moved to look at the productivity of human beings, productivity of people in an economy. And so, long story short, I ended up finding myself drawn to doing a thesis on workforce diversity, but in comparison to performance of an institution. And I looked at a county government performance. This is Bungoma County, which is in Western Kenya. And I want to just tell you guys, because I can see most of you expatriates. When I talk to expatriates or foreigners and I talk about diversity, immediately it is assumed that I'm talking about racism or racial diversity, and sometimes gender. But then when I talk to the Kenyans in the context of diversity, everyone assumes it's gender. Like I tell someone, could we talk about diversity? Can I understand how your workspace is? And they're like, no, I don't know anything about gender stuff. And I'm like, no, it's not gender alone. And so when I started my podcast, the very first episode was about unlearning diversity. Wait, there's another click I forget. There's Kenyans who studied abroad. I know some of them are here, and I can see I only have 3 live viewers. I know it's a long day, it's a holiday, not everyone is online, and probably they'll get to watch this later. But the Kenyans who studied abroad and came back to Kenya, when I talk to them about diversity, they immediately say that, no, don't talk about diversity. Diversity is about tokenism, and it's about having people of different levels of education to sit in certain spaces. So everyone has this negative connotation on diversity, and they didn't understand it. Let's think about Corona when it happened, and we had the President of the United States talk about China virus, and it was very aggressive in his, connotation of China virus and all these things. And I thought, you know what, we are human beings. So I look at diversity in the context of humanitarianism. I look at diversity in the sense of social justice. And also, and I went ahead to do my study, but the variables I looked at, because then again, you can't study diversity in its entirety. And just like Arnav said, I'm also still a scholar. I'm still trying to learn more about diversity and learn how to better come up with programs in the country that can help most of the workforces or workspaces be inclusive and diverse. So my study looked at gender, age, and level of education. But then I want to pass it back to you, because I just wanted to give you the context within which this person, Diana, seated in front of you, decided to venture into diversity and have my podcast called Diversity with Diana. And I also think maybe for the benefit of my audience, you could tell us why you started the Development Dilemma podcast, so that then they understand why we think we should have this conversation today.
Yeah, very happy to, and thanks, Diana. And the podcast came out of conversations with close Kenyan colleagues of mine, and seeing that we were in the same workspace. They did much more senior, important jobs than I did, but nonetheless, the way we were treated in our work context was very different.
Right.
And in ways I couldn't identify, I couldn't notice, and from people whom I admired.
Yeah.
And I think it was, and who were foreigners or expats.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was seeing that repeatedly that I began to really feel there's an issue here in the work culture. It also dissipates. We've talked about the social spaces that we interact with, where true diversity, true kind of equity and inclusion isn't there. And it has dire consequences, I think, when we're speaking about, particularly when we're speaking about areas which are programs and aims to benefit people whom, if you don't know, and the people who know best are certainly Kenyans and Kenyans who are closest to those communities.
Yeah.
If you are not able to create a workspace where their ideas are kind of offered liberally and are core to the discussion in designer programs, it just quickly dissipates and cannot be useful. And I saw, sadly, many Kenyans who are close friends of mine just become very disillusioned with the work they were doing. And as Lorraine said, you're my 9 to 5 problem. At the end of the day, I walk out. And I saw that repeatedly. And it was sad to see that as really caring individuals, they felt the space hadn't been created for them. So that's where the podcast came from. And that's why it felt very important to tackle these questions, bring up hard conversations and open up that space. And you've told us a little bit of kind of the misnomers or the ways in which DEI is misunderstood. I'm curious for you, how would you define diversity, equity, inclusion, recognizing you can't cover all of it?
Well, the words are used interchangeably, but how I simply like to define diversity, it's just that the differences, we're all different in any way, be it race, age, gender, level of education, sexual orientation. I like to think of diversity as the differences that we have. So you and I can look at each other and start from the gender, our differences in gender, our differences in age, our differences in race, level of education, our differences in economic status, and so on and so forth. And just to define it as simple as that diversity simply means differences. So we don't have to, go so deep into it. Then when you think of equity and inclusion, those ones more or less correlate, because equity means being fair and just, whereas inclusion means giving people access to having similar opportunities. So, for example, Arnav working in a certain institution and Diana working in the same institution, we all have access to getting opportunities for, could it be career development, could it be any opportunity that presents itself to you should also be presented to me. So that is what equity and inclusion is. So that's why I keep saying it's sort of like a social justice kind of mechanism that allows for there to be order in our workplace, more so than it is an economic function. Because in the private sector, most organizations just want to be profitable, so they don't care that their workforce is 100% white male. It doesn't matter to them. Their bottom line is that this is what we want. But in the current world where we live, if you exclude people from different communities and different levels of understanding, then that's when you find the demonstrations that we have. The people that feel excluded say, I will boycott using this product because I don't feel like I'm represented in that space. The people that are, again, so therefore you lose your market. So if you have a product, you lose your market, that means your profit goes down. So you include people. And also diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that need to be put there by organizations, whether private sector, government, or the development sector, should be in such a way that, for example, when you recruit people and you want to meet the quotas, as ugly as it sounds, you may want to have representative workforce, but then you have programs that can allow the people that do not have the level of skill set that you need to come up to that level. So that means you become intentional in saying that, okay, so this is the workforce that we've recruited in this space. This is, we're launching a product in Kenya, and this is the workforce that is very inclusive. It looks beautiful. It looks like everyone is represented. But wait a minute, we do not have enough skill sets required. So therefore, you start having programs that allows people to catch up with what they need to do, and then you start looking at merit. Because I also do not like giving people merit without credibility. Like, for example, I don't want someone to be awarded an opportunity to serve in a board of directors, which is very critical in an institution, just because they are representing a certain minority. So therefore, it is my duty as an employer, for example, to ensure that I am not only training this person to acquire this level of skills, but also to be able to appoint them based on merit. So diversity doesn't mean that merit is not put on the table. It definitely is put on the table if the right programs are put there.
Okay, no, I think what's helpful about that is recognizing, taking beyond diversity and wanting to have representation, but seeing the responsibility of supporting those who come from those different backgrounds. So that if you want to create an inclusive space, you need to invest in that. And I think one thing that comes out there is an important distinction there between the private sector, where you can imagine a company coming into Kenya, an international company perhaps, that wants to sell a product here. They need to hire someone who knows the market well, and a Kenyan who knows, deeply how best to situate products here. And they would, and you see it. And yet in the development sector, and the reason they would do that is because they'd sell, this Danone yogurt that has no real applicability to this market, and they realize quickly we need to contextualize, we need to understand.
Right.
So there's a feedback mechanism. In the development sector, failure, and it's much more opaque because of the measurements, because of the systems. If I choose to hire and have a program designer who's based in London or the US, I don't have a quick feedback mechanism from the individuals who are not getting the benefits from this useless well, and there's plenty of examples of different water products and otherwise. And so that's what allows, I think, a particular difference in the aid sector for this kind of an ability to miss the importance of this, because you don't bear the consequences of it as the person in the organization. People do, but you don't. And I think that brings up kind of this notion of, why do you think this has become, we're talking more about it, and your podcast started in 2020. Why is this something we're talking more about in this space today?
Well, to be honest, my context was very local, and I can't wait for the conversation to come back to you guys so I hear about your experience and why you were inspired to be here today regarding diversity. Again, my context being very local, I was looking at the police brutality that happened just after Corona, where we had the presidential directive giving people curfew orders and so on and so forth. And then waking up to watching news clips, having police beat people for, you're late at work, you're working as a support staff, and therefore you finished last, and then you took public transportation and you're caught out during curfew hours, and the police brutality happened. To me, that was economic class differences, because a top level manager, a CEO, a director would not be caught out during curfew hours. And the people that were being brutalized by the police were people of a lower economic class. And, I know we hate saying this, we like to walk on eggshells on that, but the reality is that they were coming from work. And therefore, I felt that it was very insensitive of the police not to be understanding. And I think we had the president and the governor of the county of Mombasa that quickly attended to that matter. These are the people that were beaten around the Mombasa ferry for disobeying curfew orders, but it was not really done intentionally. They were actually coming from work. So I felt that injustice had happened in the local context, and that people were not being sensitive to each other's differences. It's not that they did it willingly. The other reason, I'm trying to look at my first season of the podcast. The teenage pregnancies arose in Kenya, and that was insensitivity to the gender diversity, I think. How did it emerge? We've always had teenage pregnancies cases, not just in Kenya alone. Actually, at some point in Australia, I found that the high schools started giving out birth control pills to girls because the rate of teenage pregnancies had risen. But in Kenya, it became an economic crisis, and the women or the young girls were disadvantaged because they were home and they were not in school, where they're shielded from you could say the dangers out there, because most of the girls, especially in Machakos County, had been taken advantage of by the transport people, the motorbike people that were transporting them from one point to another. And I think the data is so much, but I just felt like if we were conscious about our gender differences and what it means to be a young woman in Kenya, then we would have enabled society to allow these girls who normally probably get assistance in sanitary towels, something so basic again, from schools when the schools closed during Corona, and there were more urgent economic priorities in the households than there were providing sanitary towels for the girls. Then this made them vulnerable, and they ended up trading sexual favors to just get basic products. These are things that people in Nairobi would not normally think of, but this is what happens in the communities. And I'm talking about outside Nairobi, but within Nairobi also, there are distinct differences that if maybe I address the public policy people too much, and I'm trying to see how the conversation could be relevant to you guys. But when I address the young legislators, the young elected legislators, because those are the people that I worked with in my space, I like to tell them to think of policies that empower the young women and the young men as well. The young men are also affected. I don't want it to seem like when I talk about gender diversity, I'm talking about the young women. The young men equally also lost job opportunities in my first season of doing the Diversity with Diana podcast. And I looked at the rise of crime rate and the abuse of drugs and other societal vices that seemed systemic because of what was happening globally. And of course, that time everyone was afraid of this virus that would come, and no one was going into the communities. We got a lot of donation as the organization I work for, but no one was willing to go into the community with us to do the food distributions. And so it's just the sensitivity that we're different, and also the compassion towards the expatriate staff. I mean,
yeah, no, I'm curious
the
there.
compassion towards the expatriate staff. You guys are not living at home. You've made Kenya your home, or you've made this space your home, but you still have another home. I think it's important for countries, economies, communities to realize that we're still all we're different, but we're the same because we're human beings. And it's so interesting to me that now we shake hands. Like, you remember you're trying to greet somebody and you're like, I don't know now, do we still bump the fists, or do we handshake? And to realize that we're human beings and we belong to the same humanity. Therefore, there's nothing so different about us. So therefore, I do not think that there should be any preferential treatment of any expatriate staff. There should be no preferential treatment, but at the same time, there should be no discrimination, deliberate discrimination against any expatriate staff. I think I just want to kind of like slide into the expatriate conversation and not make my context of diversity be localized. Yeah.
But I think we need both, and I think what's nice is that it highlights the ways in which, if you're designing these programs, the types of complexities you were looking into need to be at the forefront, and it's going to be people from those communities who viscerally know these challenges, who deeply are connected and care about them in a way in which, if you can pass it, otherwise you just kind of see it offhand. I'm curious. I mean, looking at another reason this topic in the humanitarian space and development space has gone big is, of course, because of kind of the murder of George Floyd, and that sparked a conversation that's been needed from the beginning. But it caused an awakening, in a sense, an awakening only to those who are privileged enough to not feel the consequences. It's not as if it's not been an issue other people have been aware of. And I think one kind of element of that is, you see, it's something like 2% of humanitarian NGO boards are filled with people of lived experience of humanitarian issues. They don't have to be specific to the context, but at least what it means to go through such a crisis. And I think as leader of a humanitarian organization, I'd be curious how you have tried to incorporate that at board, but more your governance level in your organization.
The organization I work for is pretty new. It started in 2019, just before the onset of Corona. And it's an organization that is set out to help young people to become more economically empowered, so that they're not left vulnerable to this other, crime and life in the fast lane, which, again, prostitution and drug abuse and so on and so forth. But when Corona happened, we changed, or we added another priority area. This is just before I joined the organization. We added another priority area, which is humanitarian response, because we realized that majority of the people in the Kenyan communities, this is, you call them slums. Yes, they're highly densely populated areas. Majority of them worked in the service sector, and this is like, in the service sector, in the gig economy, informal economies. And so when Corona happened and the social distancing directives and so on and so forth, they were not able to come to work or do anything to earn a living, to put food on the table. So immediately our response was to help them have food on the table. And so we distributed over 2.1 million meals between April and December of 2020. I joined the organization in August as a consulting director, then started leading the organization in December. But after the economy was reopened and people were able to move around and trade continued, we went back into our founding mission of ensuring that the young people had economic opportunities for putting food on the table. We do not discriminate against the level of education. We're very diverse. Whether you dropped out of school in class 2 or you dropped out of school in high school, we advise the young people in the communities to join youth groups or form a youth group. If they're not formed, we help them to register it. And then we can now entrust them with capital goods, donations to start businesses. These businesses are so basic, something like mkokoteni, the hand carts for transporting goods from point A to point B, and they get decent money. We also help the girls and the boys to start hair salons. We've also done we actually have donated the sound address public address systems to them so that they can hire them out to such to such convenings, and then they make money. Our board leadership is inclusive. Founding chairman is a Kenyan-born British national. I am there as a non-executive director as well, so I represent the young Kenyan female on the board. We have Mr. Ali Mohammed, who is a Kenyan but living in Qatar from the finance sector. And then we have Mr. Graham Wood, who was the former CEO of the Aga Khan Foundation. And the reason, so we're still looking to recruit more board members, and it would be interesting to see anyone that thinks that they can add value to our board. But the reason why we're taking our time to organically develop is that we want to be cognizant of representation, but as also be cognizant of the value that the people bring to the board. And that's why when I talk about diversity, I like to make it clear that it is not just tokenism, it is about meritocracy. So I've had to earn my spot to be at that table. And then my job is to ensure that I open up more opportunities for similar young Kenyans and, you know, male and female to be in such spaces. Yeah,
and I think that makes a lot of sense. One thing I often hear, particularly when it comes to board level, there's this notion of, you know, when you talk about quotas or the need for that people often fear, well, you're just going to be hiring anyone that fits a spot, right? And you're not going to fulfill the meritocracy that I think is so important. And often something that's overlooked is, you know, how did we get the existing structures? So you don't get 2% of NGO boards, of humanitarian organizations being filled with people without lived experience, without your own quota system, be it informal, be it hidden. And so it's often this kind of, well, hang on, why do we have such an unrepresentative system if you do truly believe that that representation, that experience is important to your work? And I'm curious, are there any things you think are ways to kind of easily spot to someone working in this type of organization, perhaps as leading one, what are ways they could spot within their own organization, oh, hang on, clearly I haven't created a good, diverse, equitable, and inclusive workspace?
You know, the interesting bit is just having conversation, and this start, you can start having conversation with your stakeholders. So whichever board that you already have in place, you can start having conversations with them by saying, what do you think we need to revise or to review our board structure? Do you think we need to review our governance structure? The other stakeholders you can talk to are your employees. The other stakeholders you can also, and I think for me the most important stakeholders are the communities that you serve, because all organizations that everyone works in here, whether it's the development sector or government or private sector, there are people in the public space that you serve. So then it's good to have a meeting with them and talk to them and see whether they think that your governance system is well put together, and also just seek for their advice on how then do you think we can make it to be more inclusive. So you don't have the answer, but you can seek the answer from your stakeholders, and then, you know,
And to push you on that, I think, so one of the examples I heard is an organization that said, well, let's do this. We've had this wake of an awakening of kinds. We realize this is an issue. Let's do a survey. Let's do an anonymous survey, send it to everyone, ask people, what do they think? Are there issues of racism? Are there issues of, you know, a lack of inclusivity? And what was fascinating speaking to a friend of mine who did complete that in their organization, what she said was, we wrote down our answers, and then the next day, all of us were hush talking to each other. Do you think they know what answers I wrote down? Do you think it's really anonymous? So despite an initiative, despite an intent to make it actually open, it was situated in an organization where the trust with the leaders, with those who were designing it, meant that you still had clearly people not feeling they could share their honest answer. So how does one recognize that? It's a hard question, but how do you address that?
I think you guys have to help me in answering this one. But you know, it's so interesting, and I'll be radical with this one. If you're in an organization, and actually one of my board directors advised me this, if you're in an organization and you find that the system is not working for you, and you're just becoming, you're finding that your energy levels are going down and things are not going right, and truly you're like, the direction of this organization, it's maybe not fair, not just, not inclusive, and so on and so forth, maybe it's time for you to move. Because if you push too hard, the person you'll hurt is yourself, mentally, emotionally. If something doesn't work for you, it doesn't hurt to say, do you know what? It's been good serving you. It's been, it has been a good opportunity. Here's my notice. I serve and I want to leave. And I'm saying that radically because I also left a very good organization that I was working in, but the governance issues did not go along with my integrity values, my personal values that I had. And I did not see the need of like trying to hold a coup to pull down the entire organization. So what I did is within the procedures that I could do within the constitution of the organization, I was able to help the members to have a process to remove the bad leadership that was there. But also eventually I also had to leave. So the reality is if an organization is so bad, then there's no point of you staying there, going to work there every day, and all you're doing is complaining about their direction, their systems, and what it's not working for you. It's time to leave. And that's something I had to be told by one of my directors who said, you know what, it's actually okay to leave if something doesn't work for you. But to be honest, it doesn't mean that you don't become a whistleblower when something is happening, when something wrong is happening and you're aware about it. It doesn't mean that you don't try to help them change the systems that are there. I don't believe in fear. I don't believe in fear. Whether it's the United Nations, I'm sorry if anyone here works for the UN, I might work with you at some point. But I don't believe in fear of organizations or fear of proposing policies that work for the workforce, but also for the communities that you serve and for the local governments and the national governments of where you're based as an organization. Yeah. So I think I hope I've been diplomatic enough.
No, I think so. And this is the space not to be. Yeah. But I think it's, as you said, I think it's brave that you took that step. Unfortunately, many are in a job that they need, that they have other responsibilities. So such flexibility doesn't exist. And I think what it highlights is such flexibility doesn't exist. You have these issues, you talk about them behind people's back or behind those you can't share it with. And it festers. It festers and it becomes quite a significant problem.
Right.
I mean, it'll be, as you said, let's open it up to questions here and comments really. But one way I saw it is simply the lunch table. And it's like a high school classroom thing, but you notice where and who people sit with. And I certainly saw it in a few organizations where you just suddenly saw this divide at lunchtime, even to the point of where they would eat their lunch, let alone which table. And I think those are the kind of things which you should start to spot. And if you see that, question, well, as much as I think I'm nice, as much as I think as I'm leading this organization, I'm creating an open space, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest this isn't the case. And I think those are things you can spot. So with that, let's open it up.
No, I was saying, let's open it up. I think she has. Yeah. Is there another mic?
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks a lot. For everything, like all the things you've mentioned. I've not digested it yet, but I think it's gonna raise many questions. So I have two questions. Maybe you don't want to answer both. It's okay. You just choose. So you were saying at the beginning how diversity is actually good for the company, but I actually think it's not always good in a capitalistic context, right? Like sometimes you actually have to face that if women take menstrual leave, you're gonna have one worker less for 3 days, right? And that's not good in terms of productivity. And I ask this because I've faced these conversations many times. Like I can't use arguments of productivity. I can't tell you it's going to be good for your company. It's just fair. My only argument is justice. So I wonder, how do you approach that conversation when actually it's not good for you? You know what? You actually have to let go of your privileges. And it sucks. I'm so sorry. Like, how do you approach those conversations where it's only about empathy and justice, because there's really not benefit for you? Of course, at the end of the day, it's like, oh, but you could have a daughter, and maybe the world where she lives, right? Like, there's always a way to put it. But sometimes it's like, no, you just have to leave the stage. I'm so sorry, it's not your turn, right? So I wonder, how do you approach that? And then my second question, I don't know if there's been other podcasts where you talked about this, because I've not listened to the others, I'm sorry. But I kept thinking about, you were thinking about diversity and how there shouldn't be differences in the conditions of, and I kept thinking about salaries because I felt like it was an elephant in the room. So I know this could be a podcast, like, does it make sense to pay higher salaries, because then it's an incentive for people to leave their own homes and come, as you were saying, to a new home, which is Kenya. So I don't really know how to ask this, but how do you approach the salary issue? Because if you want to have a very diverse office, but then the differences between the salaries are so obvious and so radical, like even if you have like black people there and women and young and old, and at the end of the day, it's like a false diversity because they like you have that diversity because you're paying different salaries to that people. So I wonder how you think about this issue and how do you approach it?
Wait, I hope you're also going to help me answer the question. Okay, so like I said, I'm still a scholar on this diversity issue, and I continue to learn and unlearn as the podcast continues, and that's why we're having these conversations. I must say that when it comes to productivity, especially in the capitalistic nature, I have had very radical comments from different professors, and allow me to quote one that left me with a dilemma, dilemma podcast, but that left me in a dilemma, and I need to then take my time to research that further. And this is Professor Abonta, who is a Nigerian lecturer based in South Africa, who challenged us in class and about this social justice element and compassion and empathy. And he told us that, states like America, like countries or nations like the United States that are now beginning to talk about human rights issues and inclusion and whatnot, have had the privilege of having about 200 years to build their economies to what they are. And that's why they're able to now afford this, he calls them luxuries. So I'm giving you the far, I don't know whether it's far left or far right view of one person. And he said that developing nations like Kenya, like most African countries, do not have that privilege of having menstrual leave. I don't agree with it, especially when it comes to maternity leave, because I just think, how else do you grow up a workforce of a country without having women bear children? So he talked about menstrual leave and this compassionate leave when people die and so on and so forth. And he said that to a private organization or to a private economy or to private sector of a country, that there shouldn't be these luxuries, so-called luxuries, that the Western states try to impose on the developing nations when they know that they themselves did not have this when they were building their economies. Now, on the social justice front, as myself, I would say that it has to be a balance. Remember, I'm also a leader of an institution that has targets and objectives and missions. If I allow all my staff to be on all kinds of leaves, then there wouldn't be any work that I'm doing. Then I would have to say that you need to clock in and I'll pay you per hour that you work, and then that would be exclusive, or that would be excluding to the females or any other people that have different issues. In the inclusive world, as we are heading, where we have disabilities that include mental health, and I think 80-90% of people deal with mental health challenges at some point. So I don't know whether you consider that a disability that then allows you to have extra or excess amounts of time off to be able to recover. I think what Kenya has done, because I've also looked at our Kenyan constitution, is that it has attempted to provide a guideline for when your workforce can have different leaves. So Kenya as a country does not even allow for compassionate leave. So if your mother dies and the organization has not provided for that, the Kenyan government does not allow for compassionate leave. You will take your annual leave as if you were going on holiday to go and attend to that that unfortunate loss. So I think in a capitalistic nature, it is unfair to expect that the burden of your productivity should be borne by your employer. I think it's a give and take. So every institution should have its own set of values that is more reasonable to them. Now, in the humanitarian space, we could be more compassionate. We could say, we give you 10 days of compassionate leave should you have to incur a misfortune. But then guess what? In the developing states and in my culture, in our African culture, my uncle could die and I'll say, that was my father. He raised me like a father. He's my father. And then next week I say somebody else has passed, and then you start abusing the system that is supposed to be something that is compassionate or inclusive to you. So I don't have an answer on that. I'm just saying that I agree with you that if we push it too far, then we risk having organizations or economies not be as productive as they ought to be. And I know you're saying that because I think recently there's a country that has just allowed, it's your country. Which country is it? Spain has allowed women, it's not approved, but I think it's being legislated. The legislators are now tabling it in parliament for discussion for menstrual leave. So if you guys have the luxury to do it, then probably, I don't know. Yeah.
And I think maybe just to add to that, I think this notion of this conversation we're having today and we have in the podcast is something that many much more racist expats here will choose not to enter these spaces, and they won't have these discussions because they don't want to.
Yeah.
Right? And they'll stay
uncomfortable
in their homes and Karen and otherwise
Yeah.
because it's uncomfortable. They don't have to. And I think the thing is, what can you do to force that, to change that? Because if they have their workspaces, they have the power. What can you really do? And from a productivity point, I think we couch, it's sad to hear always diversity and equity being couched in the language of this benefit to your organization monetarily, where it's that, but it's really a social justice issue and it shouldn't have to be on the merits of productivity. But the other way we as individuals can play a role in that is to not accept certain things. And I think if you look at, there are many things today in an organization, very obvious forms of racism or discrimination that people who are aware of that wouldn't just touch that organization. And that's the way in which you're not so much giving them benefits for being more diverse and equitable, but you're certainly creating consequences for it. And so it's a weak tool, but I guess that's the other element I see. And I think on salaries, just very quickly, that these issues fester. And so if you haven't created that kind of workspace, I saw a team in another organization who the Kenyan staff really wanted a lunch table because they ate in a certain different area to where the more white expats would sit and eat their lunch. And that was an issue they tried to raise that wouldn't get addressed because it didn't, frankly, bother those who were eating in different spaces. And it's a small thing, but that's the kind of thing that was a thing people complained about, got them frustrated, and meant that when they came to work, they weren't really happy to contribute, go the extra mile, because they didn't see the organization treating them otherwise. So I think there are serious consequences when you do it wrong that could land up in productivity, but not always. But yeah.
I'll just say something small on salaries, and then I think there's another participant that wishes to contribute to the conversation. I think it's mostly the INGOs that have these huge salary disparities. And I haven't worked in an INGO. What I'm meant to understand is that it used to be that an expatriate staff automatically earns more salary, but now they have tried to levelize the salary, I guess, but they have allowances, and that's where the trick is. So they have allowances that then you find that an intern who has immigrated to a country for opportunities is probably earning so much more than a local staff, but because they've hidden it in allowances and all these other things. And there's also the simple thing, which is the power of negotiations. I just had lunch today with some colleagues of mine that have worked in an INGO, and they're Kenyans, and they put blame on the Kenyans that work in the INGO, saying that they did not negotiate better terms when they got into the organizations. So whereas we'd like to say that, okay, maybe the institutions are systemically unfair to the local staff, but there's also the point of us as local staff knowing how to negotiate for the perks before you enter the organization. So you have to be able to know that, number one, I'm not coming here because someone is doing me a favor. I'm a qualified person. I deserve to be here. I meet the qualification criteria. And therefore, as such, they have shortlisted me. I came for the first recruitment exercise. Second one, I'm in the final one. Then you need to know how to better negotiate for yourself. Beyond the monetary value, it could be another value that you get. So it's a give and take thingy. And if you guys have Kenyan friends, advise them to learn how to negotiate just beyond the salaries and the basic things. And I'm not making like blanket assumptions. I'm just saying, from my point of view, this is what I see. So there's the lady there, and then there's another one there.
I mean, we shouldn't be in a system where that's abused, but we are. And so there's the idealist view, and then there's the reality, and
sure,
there's always that balance. That's what we need to change as well.
Yeah. Hi.
I think I just wanted to touch on the productivity thing. And I think we shouldn't just assume that productivity would be impacted that much. Because, yes, we were talking about compensation or what, compassionate leave. But I would say that is like another further step, right? That doesn't really directly have to do with diversity. And there is actually a lot of research, obviously not enough because companies, private sector, and everything don't really want to hear that. But there's actually a lot of research, and I mean, I can't name any authors, but I've read articles, and there's also a really good TED Talk, but I also don't know the name of the woman, about how the diversity in an organization, be it humanitarian or like public or private sector, actually increases the well-being of your employees, and that also ties into mental health and so on and so forth. And I think onto that, where probably everyone's going to be like, oh, but now our women are going to go on leave for 3 days every month. And I think it's amazing to have this put in place because there are a lot of women who really are in excruciating pain, and they should have the opportunity to not have to work. But I don't think that every single woman in the world is gonna like not work for 3 days. And I think we also it's just a narrative that I don't think every single like that it would impact the productivity that much of a company if like we overestimate the impact that each of us have. Like, yes, we all think we do amazing work and we're such hard workers. They were like sitting at our desk 8 hours a day, but like how productive are we really? And also there's a lot of research on that people usually only work 3 to 4 hours a day. Wow. Where other countries are also trying to like shorten the workday. So yeah, I don't think that's a valid argument. And group capitalism also. And with the salaries, I think, that's definitely a big topic. It's a horrible injustice that is happening, especially as you mentioned in the international organizations. I think you also said expats get higher salary to move to a country or something, right? But especially in the globalized world that we live in nowadays, I don't know, maybe it made sense back in the day, but I also don't think so. You choose you as an individual choose if you want to move to another country and work there, I would say. And then you have to be comfortable living in that country. And I think it still comes from that notion that probably mainly white people and people from the global north need to come to a country in the global south, where these organizations, many international organizations, do their development or humanitarian aid, and they have to show people how things have to be done. That's why we have to give them an incentive to go there. So yeah, I think it's based on bullshit, and it definitely should be gone against. But I think it is sadly in most of the organizations still the case.
Okay. Before you go to the next participant, just allow me to add, because you said something right, which is bullshit. Having not that what you said is bullshit, but I'm agreeing with you saying that it's bullshit to have expatriate staff being overly compensated more than the local staff. And unfortunately, again, this is a reality that I like to deal with, because ideally that's right. But somebody told me once that we dance to the tune of the piper. So that means whoever is holding the pipe or whoever is giving the money is the one that most people tend to dance to. And it is unfair. And therefore, I do actually have a solution for developing countries, Africa, Kenya in specific, which is to try and localize the mobilization of resources. If you have programs that you need to do in your country, then why wait for the United Nations to come and do the programs? There is power for us to localize, to mobilize local resources and be able to serve your country and therefore retain the money that could have been used to pay the expatriate staff, to pay to the local staff, and allow for that money to remain in the local economy. But I also acknowledge why there's need to have expatriate staff in different spaces. The reality, as I've seen, maybe as I've read, is that when money or when the resources are being dispersed for different activities, they want to ensure that the culture and the understanding and reporting and all that is corporate governance politics, they have someone who will monitor that on the ground. Now, that was the reason why Western states justified bringing in foreign staff in Kenya. One of the countries I admire most is Nigeria. Nigeria doesn't bullshit a lot when it comes to expatriate staff, especially in the private sector. They tell you that for you to register a company and then bring X number of expatriate staff, you need to be putting this much money in our country. You need to be investing this much and have this much turnover. And that much turnover will allow you to have X number of expatriate staff. So that level of control is not there in Kenya. And therefore, I would advise, the solution I would offer to developing countries is, number one, try and localize mobilization of resources. And number two, try and have policies that restrict the number of expatriate staff that need to be in that country. That way you'll be able to solve this problem that is there. I think part of the solutions. But thank you so much for the question and participation.
Hi everyone, my name is Mwango. I guess I'll just preface like my comments with my lived experience. I lived abroad for a really significant amount of time. I would say that I spent a huge part of my adult life living in about 3 countries and also working in about 3 countries. So that also means a lot of the time being, I guess, the only Black woman in a workspace and whatever comes with that. And then on top of that, I guess moving home and I guess having that lens of, I guess, experiencing what it is to be Black for the first time and what that means in certain spaces, and then coming home and I guess seeing home in that kind of space. And I remember one of the countries that I lived was South Africa. I was finishing off my second master's there. And I was really around a lot of brilliant minds, like some of the most brilliant people I've ever met. And I remember we were having a discussion, of course, it's South Africa, post-apartheid South Africa, Rainbow Nation, all of that. And someone kind of looked at me as the Kenyan, and I usually didn't speak in a lot of those spaces because coming in as an international student and not as a South African, a lot of the time you're coming as a listener to that space. So remember someone asked me and it's like, oh, Mwango, you're Kenyan, you guys are also a settler state. What is the situation in Kenya? And I was like, and in that moment, I think it really forced me to confront a lot of the things that we are not as a country and also as Kenyans, in the sense that we have a lot of the same issues, as much as we don't have the names like apartheid and all of this. We just, a lot of the times as Kenyans and as a state, see ourselves as a post-colony. But we are a settler state in a lot of the ways that South Africa and Zimbabwe and Zambia are, and that also comes with a lot of social and economic repercussions. Now, I think when you throw in a lot of, like, say, for example, Kenya being a huge HQ for a lot of these INGOs, and I work in one, and also throwing in the fact that it's also a huge startup hub, when you throw in the mix of it essentially being a settler state, it comes with all of these different things. I mean, we talk about it all the time when you go to restaurants and waiters will serve white people before us, but we're still paying shillings. We are at work, and Alpi and I were both, I would say, and I'm not going to, very educated Black women, and you are being supervised by someone who's getting paid way more than you, and they're talking about a project in a part of Africa, and they're completely fucking up the name or where it is on the continent. So it's almost laughable.
Yeah.
And so I think in a lot of ways, I think as Kenyans, and I'm really glad that these conversations are happening, is that we need to confront and give names to certain things. I think also at the same time, and I was really proud of it at my workplace, we had a day, I was working somewhere before and my contract ended, but I really enjoyed it there. And again, I was the only... No, and I really enjoyed it, and I was quite shocked actually. It was a Swiss-based newsroom, and I was again, the only Kenyan or Black person working there. But they had a day where they were talking about decolonizing the workroom. And I was like, oh, you guys are doing this? You know? And I think for me, it's essentially perhaps also not necessarily being quiet. I know sometimes, you know, when you're a racialized person in a workspace, sometimes you just want to go 9 to 5, work on getting a promotion, not really disrupt the space. But I think sometimes it's necessary.
Yeah.
Especially if we're going to now go back and say, oh, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is not right. I think also, you know, again, I was saying as Kenyans, I think we need to give names to things and what they are and have open and comfortable conversations with them, about them. You know, my partner, he's Italian, and we have these very real conversations, and that really helps our relationship. And it's not that, oh, this person hates this person or whatever. I think it's really just about confronting the realities of life and the realities of inequalities. And I don't think that people should necessarily shy away from that in international workspaces. And that's just my two cents.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. I think, yeah, we need to hear more of these conversations. And guys, please help us participate. We want to hear more. How is it? How are your experiences as expatriates working and living in Kenya, Aussie? And what injustices have you seen and you felt compassionate towards, or you pitied the situation and there was nothing you could do? And then I also do like to highlight problems, but also offer solutions. Like if you look at season 1 of my podcast, and I'm just like trying to also get you guys to listen to the podcast and leave your comments. But if you look at season 1, I made a lot of noise, so much that someone told me, Diana, you're going to lose your age and you're beginning to sound like an activist who is just making noise without proposing solutions. And I decided that every time I highlight a problem, I try to propose a solution. And I'm not saying I'm the perfect one or I'm the best, but from where I see this, the solutions that I propose on how to handle certain injustice issues that we face. But let's hear more, and thank you so much for sharing. That was really good, and we need to continue having these conversations.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what you said is giving it a name is so powerful, and identifying it. And I think the more we can do to, in this space, explicitly talk about decolonization, explicitly talk about racism in our workplaces is critical, because otherwise we think of it in this notion of diversity, and that can sound rosy and easy without the seriousness of the consequences it has on those who aren't shared. So, thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good.
So to go back to your point that, like, I think one of the last things you mentioned was if you're unable to affect change in organizations, it's better to just walk away from it. But sometimes if you want to affect change in the world that you live in, because a lot of the world we live in is unequal, it's difficult to walk away primarily because you have to affect the change no matter how difficult it is. Additionally, to go back on the conversation, or rather the topic about the salary gap and the disparity that it involves, is that when reviewing, like, most situations that I've come across here, is that there's always a disparity when it comes to people that come from different parts of the world. So, like, you might have someone who's working in the same organization that comes from, like, I don't know, the Americas or Europe, and someone else with a similar set of qualifications being evaluated through a whole different lens, primarily because they come from somewhere else, say Kenya, South Africa, wherever it may be. And I think even though we might be decolonized these days, officially speaking, the concepts and the social factors that came with colonization still exist today and are the subjective, effective factors in why we have discrimination in many different organizations as social structures.
I think I agree with you. No, you're definitely right in that. I'm just I like to swing between reality and also just being a little radical in how I'm thinking. And in decolonization and the wishful thinking of how things ought to be done, sometimes I just kind of wait for people to die. I'm being serious right now. When you look at leaders that lie to us as Africans to vote for them, and they offer this wonderful solutions that they published and what they're going to do when they get into leadership, and you give them the opportunity to get there, and they totally change and embody the evilness that they actually spoke against before they got into power. You're like, what is the solution here? You can't kill them. You just wait for nature to take its course. And guess what? People do die. No one is here forever. And I'm just thinking of decolonization. If you guys have had a chance to look at the Kenyan Constitution, or maybe where it came from and how it started being drafted, and you look at the sessional paper number 10 of 1965, this is now when Kenya became a state, and we had like a think tank made up of very smart Kenyans and a few other smart people that were around, and they wrote the Kenyan Constitution and the Kenyan economic strategies. We to our neighbors, to the East African communities, we as Kenyans looked like we are going to be very capitalistic. We were going to be like the leaders of Africa when it comes to economic prominence. But we didn't do that. We didn't implement our own papers that we wrote. Maybe that worked to our favor or not. And a country like Singapore, Singaporeans came to Kenya for benchmarking, believe it or not, because at the time in 1965, we were both third world countries. And they benchmarked in Kenya and took our strategic plan and went and implemented it as it was supposed to be. And they're now a first world country. My point about maybe linking decolonization and what I'm about to say about Tanzania, where Kenya had a capitalistic constitution or strategy paper for the country, Tanzania had the opposite. Tanzania had the Ujamaa philosophy, where it was more about socialization. In fact, they said, is it Africanization of the economy, or social? It was a social justice thing. So they were so socially aligned that it would almost seem like Arnav would work 8 hours a day and Diana would work 2 hours a day, but we get the same pay. Our families get the same amount of benefits that they ought to get. Yet I'm doing so much less work and he's doing so much more work. And that of course failed. That didn't work. But there are some values that maybe even as East African community where we could have sat down together. And this is, I don't know, I kind of feel like the Westerners, the colonialists, they implemented this strategy of divide and conquer. So you plant seeds of discord in such a manner that the East African community never united, and we agreed to be defined by the boundaries that were set by the colonizers, and therefore we never really united to come together and say, let's borrow the strong parts of the socialism constitution that was drafted by the Tanzanians. Let's also borrow the productive elements of the Kenyan constitution, and let's work together as an East African community bloc and grow our country. So we're still very much colonized, and I don't know. I mean, I'm just waiting for people to die, because I'm kind of hoping that I'm going to be here a bit longer than they will be. And I'm also trying to, I have so much hope in the younger generation that are more open to having these conversations. I mean, if you tell my dad, who works, hey, I'm not going to say, but if you tell him and his generation to speak up against the impunities that they face, they would never. They're like, nope, I am almost retiring. I'm about to retire. I want to get my benefits in peace. And I'm not like you guys who just, quit your jobs randomly and do whatever you want, as if there are no consequences. But at least for us, we also benefit from this space that has so many things that we can do. I mean, come on, guys. We're at Lava Latte, a place that is owned by young Kenyans. I mean, that's so cool, no?
Yeah.
It's so cool. So anyway, yeah.
Great. Yeah, and I think, the history of Pan-Africanism is also in contrast to the constant sabotages of Western countries. And there's tons of history and facts of the ways in which they've tried and continuously do to sabotage it. So I'm going to put you on the spot, if that's okay, because you mentioned was one of the brave hands to say, actually, I have a workplace that has some of these features, is diverse, is equitable in some ways, and inclusive.
Yeah.
But I'd love to get your thoughts on some of this.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Gibbs. I worked in 2 Kenyan Expat workplaces, one in the for-profit, one in the non-profit space. And I've had diverse experiences from most positive to something's going on here. And what I can say is that I think if I think of specific examples where I have observed that aspect of equity, it is where my potential has been identified, and that has translated to promotions, that has translated to increase in salary, even to the extent of putting my role and level equal to expatriates, in the organization, and that was without me having to do what I have been accustomed to, which is like self-advocacy and being amazing at my job 24/7 and working days and nights and weekends, and just I was really having to advocate for like my next transition or what I see for my growth, right? So that's one piece that. So I started kind of doing the thing of thinking through if I could think of like metrics for me to measure in an organization, like how do I feel in terms of diversity, inclusivity. So one of it is it's not talking about diversity and inclusivity from like the HR perspective, right? Unfortunately, what ended up happening to me is that for me rings up, like it sets like red flags. Like you're talking about this a lot. I wasn't actually thinking about this too much. I was more focused on my job while we talk about it so much, which it could be my own like bias, right? So I ended up like setting up like my own metrics, and one of those was walking in and looking around and just identifying. It is great that there are opportunities for diverse people from different countries and backgrounds. It is amazing that there are expatriates who have talent, who have certain skill sets that might be more difficult to find on the continent, who are finding this a good place to work and excited about coming into the continent and coming to Kenya and actually bringing in that skills and that contribution. That's great, right? And so what I end up doing is observing and just balancing that against, but it's the potential of different individuals being identified equally, right? And to do that, you sort of have to, yes, there is a standard where you're looking at like productivity and competence and are you able to deliver, but then there's also the nuance of how I don't know if you guys have been involved in like the hiring process is broken globally, the promotion process, like we can't actually say, it is not actually possible. It is very difficult to say that selecting a certain individual for a role or promoting a certain person was 100% objective, that it was data, because it's always human beings making that decision. So it's always the element of bringing in your own personality and perspective. So observing that potential is identified across the board, regardless of the accent, regardless of what university you went to, but potential is observed and opportunities are presented and people are given chances to access certain opportunities. That is one of my key metrics for like, do I feel that this is a diverse space? So I hope that's
Yeah, fantastic. And maybe to add to that, so there's an incredible speaker called Emmanuel Acho, and he has this amazing YouTube series called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, and I recommend everyone to check it out. He is just spectacular. And what he said about this, and what I love, I think equity and inclusion, the way he sees it is diversity. The other way he puts it, I think, is the difference between being invited to come to like invited and welcome at the dance versus being invited to dance. And those are the ways I think you can make it a bit more visual as well.
And maybe just to also give I hope this is humorous example. It's I don't know if I have a very strong Kenyan accent. I get feedback that I don't. It's because in high school I went to I speak this way. I wonder if I would be perceived differently if I spoke this way and if I talked with a more Kenyan accent. And so sometimes I've wondered, like, even the more access and opportunities I've gotten and how my contributions have been accepted have been based on how I speak and perception and so on, and having more of I think what is called like a neutral accent. So that's just one example. And so it's been awesome, when I walk into a space and you see opportunities, potential identified, an organization that puts the work to identify potential, regardless of those cultural differences. And one example I was giving is just, a different accent.
That's interesting, yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you so much for contributing. I think you are lucky enough to have been working in such a space that identifies potentials in different people.
I just wanted to thank both of you, first of all, for always creating these conversations, both in different environments, in live audiences, which can, I imagine, be much more intimidating than when you do it offline or perhaps on your own spaces.
Yeah.
So really want to commend both of you, for converging and doing it together as well. That's awesome to see. And just having this conversation here and hearing all these perspectives. I wanted to go back to two things. One, maybe a disagreement on one thing, but more to build on what you said.
Sure.
But another is actually to go back to a principle that we should be maybe discussing more. And menstrual leave is one example, right? You mentioned it could spiral or it could go a certain direction. So first of all, productivity days matters for some jobs. It doesn't matter for all jobs. Cab drivers, you need to work those days. You need to get that income. Tailors, there's a skill, capital, time job that will matter too. Some of our jobs, I don't know what the ratio is here. I imagine that's not how we work. Right? When I hire someone, and I've been in lucky enough positions to be hiring people for a while, I'm looking at how badass they are. Can they get the job done? Do I trust them to get the job done? If they need time off, great. Are they getting the job done? Great. That's all I care about.
Yeah.
It's not the hours of work or the emails you've sent or the Slack messages you sent. That's irrelevant to productivity. The more you're doing, sometimes I might worry about that. Are you getting stuff done, or are you just telling everyone else what you think? Most of the time, there's an inverse correlation to that optics as well. So thinking about, so that's a principle, right? I might lead with that principle. I might run a team with that principle. How you create a corporate governance structure that cuts across companies with principles like that is a different problem. The world, maybe not the world, some parts of the world are experiencing this amazing realization that flexible work hours might actually work for some companies. Employees have been arguing for this for a while. COVID made it go like, oh my God, I guess this works, even though everyone knows. It's important to remember you have two types of customers as an employer. So internal customers who are working for you, who can leave you, and you will be harmed by them leaving if they're good, especially if they're good. And the ones who are good will leave the fastest because they know their worth. And there's obviously external customers. You should think about customer retention all the time.
Sure.
One way to also keep retention is to think about their future independent of your company. You're investing in their growth as an individual, in fact, as a potential ally for something you build together decades from now, 5 years from now, whatever it is. Keep those ideas in mind. How do you build that as a general corporate governance issue? Sure, rules, regulations, laws, yes. Sometimes those become checkboxes. You have to be careful about that. But are there companies that can showcase it? Lure great talent to them, so you need to compete on that front. Important to keep that in mind as well. So menstrual leave, shocker, if anyone is surprised that that's a reality that women face, sometimes more severe than others, sometimes the same person facing whatever it might be. But if you haven't thought about this before, that's a problem. It doesn't have to be leave, but if you're looking at productivity from days at the office, that's a problem in my eyes. And frankly, if that's a problem you're facing, come work for me. So there's that aspect of it. Second, the part I might disagree, and this is speaking as an expat, as an expat with some melanin content, being Pakistani. I think you mentioned something, and I don't think you said it with a strong conviction, what you were saying, like maybe we should just limit expats. Every country has some availability and some restrictions on how they allow immigration to happen. Right? So work permits over here are a process. If you limit work permits, it will not be the British who will be kicked out first, it will be me.
It will not be?
It will be Somalis, in fact, for the first one, in my view. The weakest possible country, with the least resistance, the weakest nationality with the least resistance, they will be the first to go out. We need to be careful about these ideas because expat is not white. Expat is just someone who's from abroad. So it's not to disagree with the concept. Restrict more if you want, that's the country's policy. Enable more if you need, that's the country's policy. But be careful when you think about bans or limitations, because how and who it affects becomes important. It's not always privilege bringing people over. Sometimes it's refuge, and in my case, not refuge. I love it here. I'm very grateful to be here. I've met beautiful friends, my partner, So many wonderful things I'm grateful for. I would love to stay.
You're not being kicked out. Ozzy, no. I made the example specifically with Nigeria because I was also working there now as an expatriate. And I remember just having to set up a company and being given all these restrictions and being told that for the amount of money that the company you work for is bringing into this economy, you're only allowed to have 2 expats. And I was like, wow, I've never had that in Kenya. And then maybe that is something that I could learn more. But Kenya is far more capitalistic than any other state I know around us. And if that works for us, then fine. If it doesn't work for us, then there's room to have conversation. And this is, part of the contribution that we get, because I don't think conversation is that you come to have your ideas or your farms. It's to have some other ideas being presented to you and, and give me room for further research or further finding. Yeah, but thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Usman. I think what you highlighted is that notion of, especially in spaces where creative work, thoughtful work is critical, these things fester, these issues fester, they grow and they spread, and they very quickly break down the trust that is so critical to vulnerable, open sharing of ideas. So we'll take one more question, and then I think we'll then draw to a close, because we want to get to the breakout groups where clearly people have a lot of ideas to share. So we'll take one more.
It's funny, your last line was the perfect segue to my question, actually. I think one question that's been on my mind for a while has been, most companies, most organizations don't start off being great on all these fronts, right? Like, they're somewhere in the process, they're somewhere in the spectrum. And when an organization is grappling with some of these DEI issues and thinking they're taking it seriously, one major thing that hamstrings like meaningful discussion or meaningful change is like the trust deficit. And so what I've seen happen in my organization is that, people know there are issues, but how do you make the conversation around those issues open? Because what I've seen happen is that, as someone who's faced issues, as someone who's been on the sidelines of issues, others are facing there are these kind of echo chambers, or people are kind of, airing their resentments amongst each other, not really feeling that they can talk about it with others, and then there are others who are just oblivious. And then this is something you said initially as well, and I'm like, you heard about this through your Kenyan coworkers who were friends, and so I was just curious to hear from you both and others in the room, what works to create that openness, because that's something I've struggled with. We have DEI committees, and we have ostensibly people from various differences along the spectrum, but having an actual open conversation, getting real, that's really hard. I find it to be really hard. And I think 2 things that have helped me personally when I've wanted to raise those issues is, one is friendship and actual relationships. The other thing that's really helped is to see leadership that looks like me. Because that helps me feel like I can go up to this person and say, look, you probably understand this, but and I think organizations that do well, do, think about representative leadership seriously, and I think that really works. But yeah, I'm just curious to hear what you have felt works and what others have felt works, because that's a struggle that I have.
Well, just thank you for sharing. I think I'm going to quote Emmanuel Acho again, and I'll link him on our pieces. But he says this thing where if people don't feel they can talk with you, they'll talk about you. And that says it quite succinctly, that you haven't got the trust there, people will resort, and they will want to talk about these issues because they feel it. I think in my context, got very lucky with people who were very generous and willing to be vulnerable. I came in super ignorant right out of university. I hadn't chosen Kenya deliberately. It more was an offer given to me because of immense privilege. And so when I came, I think I was aware of this ignorance. I didn't do the research I should have and read the books I should have, which I had to do when I got here. But I guess maybe, and my parents, we were at dinner with some of them last night, they, I guess, saw that I was ignorant, naive, but cared to learn. And so it took their vulnerability and generosity, and I guess I was a little bit aware of some of my ignorance, and I still need more to learn. But yeah, that's a piece. I think those 2 things you highlighted are really crucial. Seeing someone who looks like you makes a world of a difference in terms of what you feel you can share and to who.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say just what you said, like cultural sensitivity and being willing to learn. And funny enough, that the solutions to most of these challenges that we face just lie in the soft skills of being able to, number one, recognize when you have privilege. Like he just said, he came here because an opportunity was presented to him based on immense privilege. That is the level of self-awareness that you have to acknowledge that. And I would say the same. For me to sit here, it's based on opportunities that were presented to me and doors that were opened to me by people that came before me, not because that I was born with a silver spoon on my hand, but because some people cared enough to invest in me and do so much more. But I sit in front of you having never gone to private school, maybe up to the age of 25, and I'm a product of Kenyan public school education. But I can tell you what maybe made the jump for me to be able to walk in certain spaces all the way to the opportunities that I've been given to serve in a national and international level is because of the soft skills that I've learned, the relational skills that I have. And that means that if you have a workspace and you're looking at leadership and you're looking at your position, like you just said, you have a better relationship with someone, and that's when you talk to them. It's the soft skills that set you apart. It's not the papers that you have or the degrees or the skills or whatever. It is actually just the soft skills, being culturally sensitive, aware of your surroundings, being aware of the privileges that you've had probably, being able to allow other people that have not had such opportunities to grow, and maybe holding their hand to come to a better place. So I think to answer your question is, it's the soft skills, the trust, the loyalty. There's things that cannot be quantified in monetary value, and these things that you probably not taught in school. No one teaches you loyalty in school, or this is how you stay loyal to an organization. These are things that you pick up along the way, and if you're lucky enough, you actually get to learn them from your families. I have one of my mentors is a judge who is 60 years old, and she says that in her courtroom, every criminal that comes through, of course, later, every suspect who later gets, incriminated, that comes through, she can actually point back to parenting or something that got broken as they were being raised. And some of them are, most of them are not deliberate. You don't get to choose which family you're born to. You don't get to choose the places where you're born to. So when we go to workspaces, and maybe that could be one of our take-home points, is that have a little bit more compassion with people around you, with people that are different from you. I actually like what you're saying, and I'm going to pick your style of leadership and your style of working and try to incorporate it in my space, because I think it's so powerful to consider the output of the staff that work with you just beyond the 8 to 5. Did you clock in today? How many leave days have you had this month? And therefore, I'm going to give you a warning letter because you didn't do that, because those are the systems that we come into. But I think we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to humanity to be the change that we want to see. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very nice place to close. And I think as a last thought, I have felt, sitting on this side, if we as expats, foreigners, make that first step of showing we're vulnerable, showing we're cognizant of some of these issues, I've found that's been a place where Mary and Lorraine, other friends, have recognized that good intent and been very quick to then open up and share, and that's allowed friendship and exchange. And I guess the other element is, I really think friendships, like I really think the social spaces are key. Workplace, great, but you need, it wasn't until I had close Kenyan friends that I could really understand and have an empathy, because without that, I didn't feel or care as much about the issues they face. And it really took that, sadly, before I started to care as much. So I guess I would add to that. And as a way to close, because we'll then open up to breakout to discuss this as a group in smaller sessions, where can people find your podcast?
Oh, well, thank you. My podcast is on all the streaming platforms, Spotify, now I forget all of them. But you can find me on Spotify, iTunes, which other one? YouTube channel. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook. I do like talking a lot about diversity and inclusion, and funny. And like I said, I started this in 2020 during Corona, and it's because I was feeling like a mini activist, and the only war room that I could go to was my laptop and going online and talking against these things and talking against injustices that were being done, that I just felt like there was lack of empathy. But people were watching, and out of the 33 people that I have at the time, I got an opportunity to be invited to serve in the youth sounding board for the Danish embassy, because they felt like they do a lot of investment in Kenya, and they wanted to have a youth sounding board made up of 9 Kenyans from across the country to help them ensure that their programs are being well executed to the needs of the Kenyan youth, because they did have that money to do so. And as a result of that, many other embassies are now thinking of setting up youth sounding boards. UNDP already had a youth sounding board. That's not an embassy, but it's an agency of the United Nations. And I think it was a privilege for me. And as I exit the youth bracket, I'm hoping that the other youths that will join the board will also be able to give them good input and good value in maybe just putting the money in the right spaces and in the right programs that they do in the country. And guys, yeah, please leave your comments on my platform. I'm still learning. I need to unlearn other things. I need to improve my knowledge and my work. I am a young policymaker in Kenya. I already serve in one of the political parties' tribunal, dispute tribunal. And you see, such spaces help me to be able to put into practice my idealism or the things that I think could work. And that means that, imperfect as I am, I still have an opportunity to serve, and it would be good to get value, like incredible input from guys such as yourselves to allow us to be better people in the spaces that we work in. And I'm sure you do the same. I know you're working in the development sector, and I know that the work you do, just beyond having these conversations, you'd probably at some point put them in as recommendations or proposals to certain agencies that would be able to listen to you. And even organizations such as the Jonathan Jackson Foundation, where I work, if we can get input of what you think we could be doing better, we would be happy to listen, because we don't think that you're perfect and we don't operate in a vacuum. So your expertise as a Kenyan Expat, maybe in helping us to design a volunteer program better, or an expert program where we could be having some of you volunteer half a day of a week to come and work with us and make our programs be better. It would be important. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Diana, for making the time on this evening, and for all of you for contributing so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Great. So with that, what we'll do is just take 5 minutes, have a small break, and we'll bring back to these breakout groups, and knowing it's late in the evening,